This is the story of how Portland, Oregon, a city that spent years positioning itself as a model of progressive urban governance, created conditions so hostile to basic retail operation that a discount grocery chain serving working-class shoppers on tight budgets decided that staying open was no longer financially defensible. It is a story about theft policies and drug laws and public safety decisions that compounded on top of each other over the course of nearly a decade, producing a retail environment that insurance actuaries and loss prevention analysts and store-level managers all described in terms that pointed toward the same conclusion. And it is a story that matters beyond Portland, because the conditions that drove Grocery Outlet out of specific Oregon locations are not unique to one city or one state. They are the visible leading edge of a policy experiment that several American cities conducted simultaneously, and that is now producing results that can be measured in closed storefronts and eliminated jobs in neighborhoods that have lost access to affordable food. Before we get into today's story, I need to be honest with you for a moment. Over 90% of people who watch these videos still haven't subscribed yet. And considering how quickly the economic landscape is changing in America right now, staying informed matters more than ever. If you enjoy these deep dives into business collapses, economic shifts, store closures, and the real reasons companies are abandoning cities like Portland, take a moment to hit that subscribe button. It's completely free, and it helps this channel continue producing these in-depth reports. And before we begin, I want to hear from you. Do you think more grocery chains will continue leaving Oregon over the next few years? Let me know in the comments below. Most people outside the Pacific Northwest have a general impression of Grocery Outlet without necessarily knowing the name or the specific format. The chain operates on a model that is genuinely different from conventional grocery retail. Rather than stocking a standard inventory at standard prices, Grocery Outlet purchases surplus merchandise, closeout lots, packaging changes, and overstock items from manufacturers and distributors at significant discounts. Then passes a portion of those savings to shoppers in the form of prices that conventional supermarkets cannot match. A family buying cereal and canned goods and frozen protein at a Grocery Outlet location is typically spending meaningfully less per basket than they would at a Safeway or a Kroger banner store for comparable nutritional content. The format is specifically designed to serve price-sensitive shoppers, which means the people most dependent on Grocery Outlet locations are precisely the people who have the fewest alternatives when those locations close. They are not shoppers who can absorb a price increase by switching to a slightly more expensive store without consequence. They are shoppers for whom every dollar of weekly grocery spending represents a real constraint on everything else in their household budget. The company itself is based in Emeryville, California, and operates more than 500 stores across the western United States, with a significant concentration in California, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. It went public in 2019 and trades on the NASDAQ under the ticker OGO. Its business model depends on thin margins across high volume, which means that any location where shrink, the industry term for inventory loss through theft and spoilage, runs significantly above the company's planned tolerance for loss, becomes a location that cannot generate the financial performance required to justify its continued operation. The math is not complicated. When the gap between what comes in the door and what gets paid for at the register widens past a certain threshold, the store stops making money. When it stops making money consistently enough, the company closes it. That is not a political decision. It is arithmetic. Understanding why that arithmetic broke down in specific Portland locations requires understanding what happened to Oregon's approach to retail theft and drug enforcement over the roughly decade-long period that preceded the closures. The story begins in the version most frequently cited by retail industry analysts and business groups, with Oregon's 2014 restructuring of its theft statutes. Prior to that change, theft of merchandise valued above $200 constituted a felony in Oregon. After the restructuring, the felony threshold rose to $1,000, meaning that stealing up to $999 worth of merchandise in a single incident became a misdemeanor rather than a felony. Oregon was not alone in making this kind of adjustment. California made a similar change through Proposition 47 in 2014, raising its felony threshold to $950. Several other states made comparable adjustments during the same period. Driven by a combination of concerns about mass incarceration, the disproportionate impact of felony records on lower-income defendants, and research suggesting that harsh sentencing for property crimes did not produce the deterrent effects that justified the incarceration costs. The policy logic had genuine merit when examined in isolation from implementation realities. Clogging the criminal justice system with felony prosecutions for relatively modest property crimes did impose real costs on defendants and on the public, without necessarily producing outcomes that justified those costs. The problem was not the theory. The problem was what happened in practice when the threshold change interacted with enforcement decisions made at the local level. With prosecutorial discretion exercised by district attorneys who had their own views about which cases deserved attention, and with a retail environment that was simultaneously experiencing other changes that compounded the effect of the threshold adjustment. In Portland specifically, the period from 2017 through 2023 saw a convergence of conditions that retail operators described in terms that were consistent across different companies, different store formats, and different neighborhoods. Organized retail crime groups became increasingly active in the Portland market, with teams of individuals systematically hitting multiple stores in coordinated patterns that bore little resemblance to the opportunistic individual shoplifting that loss prevention frameworks had historically been designed to address. The $1,000 threshold meant that individual incidents in these coordinated operations frequently fell below the felony line, even when the total value taken across multiple hits at the same location in a single day represented a significant financial loss. And because each incident was evaluated individually rather than aggregated, the cumulative pattern of organized activity often did not trigger the prosecutorial response that the scale of the criminal enterprise would have warranted under a different statutory framework. Insurance costs reflected what the data was showing. Commercial property and general liability premiums for retail operations in Portland's most affected zip codes rose substantially through this period, as insurance actuaries incorporated the loss experience into their pricing models. For a thin-margin retailer like Grocery Outlet, insurance premium increases are not an abstraction. They are a direct reduction in the profitability of the affected locations. When premiums rise because the risk environment has deteriorated, the financial case for continuing to operate in that environment weakens in proportion to how much the premiums rise. And they rose enough in specific Portland markets to be a standalone factor in location viability assessments. Measure 110, which Oregon voters passed in November 2020, added another dimension to the operating environment that retailers were navigating. The measure decriminalized possession of small amounts of drugs, including heroin, methamphetamine, and cocaine, replacing criminal penalties with a civil citation system, and directing tax revenue from marijuana sales toward addiction treatment services. The policy intention was to shift Oregon's approach to drug addiction from a criminal justice framework to a public health framework, an approach that had shown genuine promise in Portugal and other international contexts where it had been implemented alongside robust treatment infrastructure. The Oregon implementation faced an immediate and serious problem. The treatment infrastructure that the policy assumed would absorb people diverted from the criminal justice system was not built out at the scale or speed that the policy required. Civil citations were issued but rarely paid. The treatment referral system functioned poorly in practice, and the visible result in Portland's downtown and in neighborhoods across the city was a significant increase in open drug use in public spaces, including in and around retail locations. For store managers and employees at ground level, the change in the daily operating environment was not theoretical. Workers described encounters that their training had not prepared them for, and that their employers had not equipped them to handle safely or effectively. Grocery stores, which by their nature serve a broad cross-section of the community and operate on tight margins that do not support the kind of security infrastructure that higher-margin retail formats can afford, were particularly exposed to the conditions that Measure 110's implementation produced on Portland's streets and in its public spaces. The specific grocery outlet locations affected by the closures were not in Portland's most affluent neighborhoods. They were in areas where the shopping population included a significant proportion of lower-income households, many of them in communities of color, for whom a nearby discount grocery option represented a meaningful part of their household food strategy. When Grocery Outlet closed those locations, it was not removing a luxury amenity from a neighborhood that had multiple alternatives. It was removing one of the few affordable food options available to shoppers who were already navigating a challenging economic environment. The concept of a food desert, a geographic area where residents lack reasonable access to affordable and nutritious food, is typically associated with suburban or rural areas that have never had significant retail development. Portland's closures created food access problems in urban neighborhoods that had previously had functioning grocery infrastructure, which represented a different kind of failure with its own specific consequences for the residents left behind. The company's public statements around the closures were careful in the way that corporate communications around politically sensitive decisions tend to be careful. Grocery Outlet did not release detailed breakdowns of theft losses by location, or publish the insurance premium data that informed its closure decisions. It did not issue press releases specifically attributing closures to Measure 110 or to Portland's specific policy environment. What it did do was close stores, and the stores it closed were in the locations where the conditions produced by those policies were most concentrated. The pattern was legible even without the explanatory narrative that the company chose not to provide publicly. Other retailers were making the same calculations at the same time and reaching the same conclusions. Walmart closed multiple Portland area locations. Cracker Barrel shut its Portland restaurant. Lloyd Center, once one of the largest indoor malls in the Pacific Northwest, saw its anchor tenants leave and its remaining retail mix deteriorate to a point that made the facility's long-term viability a genuine question. The exits were not coordinated, and they were not organized around a shared political statement. They were independent business decisions made by different companies operating in different formats with different customer bases that all pointed in the same direction because they were all responding to the same underlying conditions. Portland's downtown vacancy rate reached levels during this period that commercial real estate professionals described as among the most severe they had observed in any comparable American urban market. The figure that circulated most consistently in industry analyses placed the downtown office vacancy rate above 25% by 2024, with street-level retail vacancy in some downtown blocks running even higher. An empty office building produces no lunch customers. Empty retail storefronts produce no foot traffic for the businesses that remain open. The deterioration was self-reinforcing in ways that made recovery progressively harder the longer the conditions persisted. Oregon's political leadership eventually recognized that Measure 110, as implemented, was not producing the outcomes its supporters had intended. In early 2024, the Oregon legislature voted to recriminalize drug possession, restoring criminal penalties for possession of small amounts of controlled substances. Governor Tina Kotek signed the recriminalization bill in March 2024, an acknowledgement that the policy experiment had not worked in the way its proponents had hoped. The reversal was significant as a matter of political honesty. It represented a willingness by Oregon's Democratic-controlled legislature to acknowledge that a signature progressive policy initiative had produced consequences that outweighed its intended benefits, at least in the form it had taken in practice. That kind of acknowledgement is not common in political environments where admitting policy failure carries significant costs, and it deserved recognition as an act of genuine civic accountability. What the recriminalization could not immediately do was undo the years of accumulated damage to Portland's retail ecosystem and to the businesses that had made location decisions based on the conditions that had developed during Measure 110's implementation period. Grocery outlet locations that had already closed did not reopen because the legislature changed the law. Workers who had lost jobs at those locations did not get called back. Shoppers who had reorganized their grocery habits around the absence of the stores they had depended on did not immediately return to a normalized retail environment, because the policy that had contributed to abnormal conditions had been revised. The commercial real estate market does not reset quickly. Tenant relationships, once severed, require new negotiations, new build-outs, new lease structures, and new operational planning that takes months or years to execute, even when the business case for returning to a market improves. The retail theft question also did not resolve itself with the recriminalization of drug possession, because the two issues, while related in their effects on the operating environment, had distinct legal and enforcement dimensions that required separate responses. Oregon's felony theft threshold remained higher than many comparable states, even after the 2024 changes, meaning that the statutory framework around organized retail crime had not been comprehensively reformed in ways that would materially change the loss environment that had driven the insurance premium increases and the shrink calculations that contributed to store closure decisions. The enforcement capacity of Portland's police bureau, which had been significantly reduced through the period following the 2020 unrest and the subsequent policy debates around public safety funding, had not been rebuilt to levels that would meaningfully change the deterrence environment for organized retail crime operations. Portland's defenders make arguments that are worth taking seriously rather than dismissing. The city's technology sector, anchored by Nike's global headquarters in nearby Beaverton and a growing cluster of software and hardware companies, remained a genuine economic asset through this period. Intel's presence in the Hillsborough area represented one of the most significant concentrations of semiconductor manufacturing capability in the United States, an asset whose national strategic importance became increasingly recognized as the domestic chip production debate intensified. The city's food and beverage industry, its craft brewing and distilling scene, its restaurant culture, continued drawing visitors and generating economic activity even as downtown retail deteriorated. New business formation in the Portland metropolitan area did not collapse in ways that suggested the entrepreneurial ecosystem had been fundamentally destroyed. The counterargument is that these assets were operating alongside and in spite of conditions in Portland's core that were visibly deterring the kind of large-scale retail and commercial investment that urban neighborhoods require to maintain their economic vitality. Nike and Intel are not downtown Portland businesses. Their presence in the metropolitan area does not substitute for functioning neighborhood grocery stores in the communities where grocery outlets served working-class shoppers. The tech sector's continued activity did not prevent Grocery Outlet from doing the math on its Portland locations and concluding that the math no longer worked. The workers who lost jobs when those stores closed were disproportionately people without the credential profiles and compensation levels that would allow them to pivot quickly into the technology sector, whose continued presence Portland supporters cited as evidence of the city's fundamental health. A person who stocked shelves at a grocery outlet in outer southeast Portland and a software engineer working remotely for a company headquartered in the Pearl District are both Portland workers, but they are not experiencing the same labor market or navigating the same set of options when a major employer in their sector makes a decision to exit. The food access consequences of the closures fell most heavily on the households least equipped to absorb them. A family with a car and discretionary income can reroute their grocery shopping to a Safeway or a Fred Meyer or a Costco when a grocery outlet closes nearby. A family without a car, budgeting carefully on a fixed income or a low hourly wage, depending on the walkable retail options within their neighborhood, faces a genuinely different problem when the affordable store in walking distance closes and the alternatives require transit trips that add time and cost to every grocery run. The people who built Portland's policy environment rarely lived in the neighborhoods where its consequences were most concentrated. That gap between who makes the decisions and who lives with the outcomes is not unique to Portland, but it was particularly visible in the pattern of closures that followed from the conditions Portland's policies created. Oregon has time to rebuild the retail environment that the policy experiment of the previous decade damaged. The recriminalization of drug possession was a necessary corrective step. The vacancy rates that have accumulated in Portland's retail corridors will take sustained improvement in public safety conditions, in foot traffic, and in the investment appetite of retail operators to reverse. That reversal is possible, but it requires political will that has not always been easy to sustain. In a city where the constituencies most committed to the policy frameworks that produce the current conditions remain influential in the local political environment. The shoppers who drove past that darkened grocery outlet window and kept driving to wherever they found an affordable alternative. Those people are not waiting for a policy debate to resolve itself. They adjusted because they had no choice. Some of them are driving further. Some of them are spending more. Some of them are eating differently because the store that made certain foods affordable within their budget is no longer there. Their adjustment was quiet and largely invisible in the data that measures policy outcomes at the aggregate level. But it was real, and it accumulated across enough households in enough neighborhoods to represent a genuine degradation in the quality of daily life for people who were already navigating an economy that did not give them much margin for error. Grocery Outlet did not leave Oregon because it wanted to. It left specific locations because the conditions in those locations made staying open a losing financial proposition. The company is still operating other locations in Oregon where the conditions remain compatible with its business model. It did not make a political statement. It made a business decision. But business decisions made consistently across enough companies in enough locations in response to the same underlying conditions eventually tell a political story, whether the companies making those decisions intend to tell one or not. And the story that Portland's retail exodus tells is one that the city's political leadership is still in the process of deciding how to hear. Before you leave, I want to thank you for watching this report all the way through. But I also want to remind you that over 90% of viewers still haven't subscribed yet. If you enjoy these in-depth stories about economic change, business decisions, and the industries reshaping America, please hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps this channel continue growing. And before you go, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Do you think more companies will follow this path in the coming years? Let me know in the comments below.